No mai, haere mai, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. A very warm welcome to you all today. It's great to have you online with us for this really special webinar on women and the pandemic. So I'd just like to make a few comments before we get underway. And firstly, just to note that this is a seminar that's being hosted by the North Asia CAPE. Now, the North Asia CAPE stands for, or North Asia Centre for Asia Pacific Excellence, and it was established by the New Zealand government in 2017 to promote New Zealanders' ability to engage in the North Asian region of China, Japan and Korea. And this series is part of a program that was launched last year in the pandemic, and it's around looking at the pandemic post-COVID and how we are negotiating that. We do want to make it clear that the word post does not mean that we think the pandemic is over, but it's about recognising the huge impact of the pandemic in this region. And you can read more about the North Asia CAPE on the website. And secondly, in preparing for today, I recalled my involvement in another network, university network called Association of Pacific Rim Universities. And it was in that context that the network established a Women in Leadership program at the behest of women from Japanese universities who are very concerned about the lack of women in senior leadership roles in Japanese universities. That program is still operating today, and it came out with a gender gap report in 2013, and it's went on to do some other very successful events to assist women across that network. And thirdly, I'd just like to note that we would encourage you to lodge questions, which we'll endeavour to answer at the end when we have a short question and answer session with the panel. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the panel. Firstly, I'd just like to welcome Catherine O'Connell. Catherine is the principal of a boutique commercial law firm, Catherine O'Connell Law in Japan. Catherine has a very strong business background and has been most recently recognised for her work as an entrepreneur by the British Chamber Business Awards. So we look forward to hearing more from you, of course, Catherine, from that perspective. And in that vein, I'd like to now welcome Misa Kitaoka, who is the New Zealand's Director of Education in Japan. And she's working, of course, to grow the education market in Japan, which is very welcome for many New Zealand education organisations, I have to say, Misa. And she also has a strong business background, and prior to joining ENZ, worked in a number of finance roles in the US, as well as business organisations in Japan. And finally, I'd like to welcome Jennifer Curtin. Jennifer is Professor of Public Policy at the University of Auckland and the coordinator of the Public Policy Program. Her research includes gender analysis and policy making, and you will often see Jennifer, in fact, as a public commentator, and most likely have seen her on media programs talking about gender and other issues, particularly around the trans-Tasman. So I'd now like to get on with the topic for today, and I know that we're in for a very interesting discussion and conversation. So Catherine, we'll start with you, and how we'd like you to outline some of the really key issues that have been facing women in Japan in the pandemic over the last 18 months.
Thanks so much, Jenny, and hello, kia ora and konnichiwa to everybody who's online. And I love seeing many of the participants who I know personally. Thank you very much for attending. So thanks, Jenny, and let me briefly set the scene with just two macro topics that show the effect on women in Japan during this pandemic, the first topic I'd like to mention is the increase in job losses. And the second topic is really a tragic topic, the increase in women who have been taking their lives, along with domestic violence cases. And it would be really remiss of me if I didn't mention that the world segment of the population that has borne the brunt of this pandemic has been women. And definitely this is the case in Japan as well. Women tend to be overrepresented in the industries that are hardest hit in this pandemic, and that would be services industry. And the pandemic's really been aggravated by gender inequality, as many more women than men report losing their jobs or have had a reduction in their hours. And this is really explained by the overrepresentation of women in non-regular work, you know, contractors or part-timers. They are mostly women. It's also due to the fact that when people leave the labor market, it's mostly women who are going out to have children. And then when they re-enter the market, there are much fewer permanent positions for people who are coming back into the labor market in Japan. In fact, half of the women in Japan who are employed are contract workers. So just think about that, compared to 1/5 of men. So that means, you know, women just really don't have that same job security or get the higher wages that permanent employees get. And secondly, this devastating figure that we've heard, unfortunate as it is, that women have been exposed, along with the job losses, inevitably their mental health has been suffering. And it's quite alarming in Japan that there's been an over 22% increase in suicide rates in Japan amongst women. You know, in fact, amongst women, I should be more clear on that, there's been a 22% increase in suicides generally, but amongst women that has gone up a horrific 83%. And that's also the case with domestic violence cases, that has gone up as well. So those are two broad topics that we are operating under in Japan. And I know for Misa, who's an amazing Japanese American woman and here in Tokyo, how's it been, Misa, actually from your perspective here?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, and kia ora, and minasan konnichiwa. And that's right, and those are some really alarming suicide rates. And just speaking of my own personal experience, I myself have experienced intense loneliness and anxiety during the pandemic. Last year, I was stuck at home. That was just pure torture. But having lived in the US for many years, I've always had a shrink. So I go see a counselor, just like going to the gym, to work on my emotional muscles. And I have benefited greatly from counseling services during the pandemic. But in Japan, counseling services are not covered by the Japanese National Health Insurance. And Catherine, this is a scheme, something like New Zealand's community services card.
Yeah, a little bit like that.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that covers primary mental health care, but that's not the case in Japan. And in Japan, we're talking about like $100, $200 US dollars per session per hour. So that's a big time financial commitment. And when I tell my friends I go see a counselor, a lot of them go, wow, Misa, that's yabai, which literally means I'm insane, or it's too radical that for me to go counseling. So there's a lot of bias and prejudice towards those who seek counseling. So we got to be working on changing that perception, as well as approaching the issue structurally by providing financial support. So with those frustrations building up, Catherine, how are you seeing the hashtag #MeToo being played out in Japan, and how is the legal community reacting to it?
Oh, thanks, Misa. And I really just want to comment on the fact that you mentioned about that subsidy through health insurance here available in Japan. Yeah. If only that was possible, maybe those rates of suicide I mentioned may not have been so high. It's hard to say, but there seems to be a correlation there. And so, you know, frustrations built up again during the pandemic on this hashtag #MeToo movement that you talked about. And you know, it's been a global movement since 2018. We all know that, but it became really quite pronounced in the pandemic, especially in Japan. I'm sure you all heard about former Prime Minister, Mr. Mori, being forced to stand down as the Japan Olympic Committee chair for making very sexist remarks. You know, he said women should be quiet in meetings and they talk too long, and that's why meetings are so long. If he got his way, we would not be here on the panel today, that's for sure. So he received a lot of backlash, and people signed a petition, and there was aggressive commenting on social media as well, from men, women, all genders. That ended up in him resigning. But that ground roots petition I talked about just now was actually put together by a young Japanese woman. She's a student activist called Momoko Nojo, and I want to give a shout out to her. In less than 2 weeks after she launched that in 2 weeks after she launched that petition, 150,000 signatures were placed on it. And so, New Zealand's Prime Minister is well placed in the radar amongst Japanese women here. But Nojo's activism for doing that petition came from Denmark. She spent a year there. And she was inspired by the Denmark Prime Minister, who is a female, and went through and did that petition. Also in February this year, Misa, we had this a group of us who are in Tokyo called the Women in Law Japan group, and I noticed one of my friends from that is on today. Thank you very much for supporting. We had an event called the Me Too Movement in Asia, and we supported that with inviting Shiori Ito, who is a journalist and at the forefront of this movement in Japan. So then also I was personally approached by an American male lawyer who told me, you've just got to go vocal as Women in Law Japan. He said he would not like it if his daughter was sitting in one of those meetings and told to pipe down. So he believed that we should go vocal, and we did. And then I think, Misa, as well, since I'm a lawyer, Kiwi lawyer in Japan, it would be an elephant in the room if I didn't just call out some of the New Zealand side of things that I saw when I was thinking about Me Too in Japan, because of course we had the recent tribunal decision in New Zealand amongst one of the most prestigious law firms that had, were called out on this particular area that really called into question some of the ways in which we treat our vulnerable staff in law firms. And those findings were also found through a New Zealand Law Society working group. And as a result, just this month, the rules of professional conduct changed. So although overdue, I think in New Zealand, these changes are happening. And I think Japan, the pace is a little slower for women lawyers here, but New Zealand and Denmark, these are great countries that can model this behavior for Japan, and I think can show some differences in how we go further forward. So I hope that captures a little bit about Me Too, Misa, from my perspective.
Yeah.
But
I think Me Too was also amplified, by just the public stress with COVID, it had been a year, like we had been stuck at home, all the frustration sort of blew up, that coincided with Mr. Mori resigning.
Yes, I think so. And I think everyone was there listening to the TV. You could see this happening every day and was really well engaged in it. So I think that's right. So before the seminar or before the webinar, Misa, we were talking a bit about how gender has really integrated a little bit further into Japan society. And especially you were talking to me about investment strategy. So I'd really love to hear from you on that. So I think people will be interested in hearing from you on that point.
In terms of investment strategy, I wanted to highlight gender lens investing, which is known as GLI. And GLI is an investment strategy that incorporates gender equality into investment analysis and decision making. So if investors start applying GLI to their investment analysis, this would become a strong incentive for Japanese companies to improve on their transparency and accountability of their gender equality practices. And it has gained global attention, including Japan. And I was just chatting with the editor-in-chief of Nikkei Cross Women magazine, and she made a very clever analogy of GLI to something like the black ships or Kurobune Raiko or Commodore Perry that ultimately led Japan to open up for foreign trade and modernization in the mid 1800s. So So in addition to those, petitioners and activists in Japan, there is a very strong financial or investors angle that's driving all the Japanese companies to put gender equality in practice. Yeah,
that's really amazing. I love that analogy.
So
it's actually
it's
quite
not
interesting.
just goodwill,
Yeah.
like companies are now forced to, and again, when we think of, the black ships coming, it's like, oh shoot, we got to put that in place. So that's sort of the general sentiments that I'm seeing in Japan.
Wow. And I think actually though, Misa, we're also seeing quite a few positive aspects coming out of this. Like that might be one of them that you've just mentioned. But I sort of see some other interesting things happening despite these challenges that I've talked about. Yeah.
So Catherine, so what are you seeing like in terms of like positive aspect of the pandemic?
Right.
Moving on to the brighter spots in the areas of like home and work, like what are you seeing on the ground?
Right. So I'm seeing flexibility, increased creativity, and also individuality observed in the home environment, work, and at school. But to go back a couple of steps, if you think about Japan, and I think it's well known, the ranking of Japan in the World Economic Forum's 2020 Global Gender Gap Index. And I know Jenny just spoke a little bit before about another gender gap index in New Zealand. Japan is 121st out of 153 countries. This really is the worst among advanced countries. And why is this? I mean, it's really going down to Japan's poor scores in economic participation and political empowerment. But work from home, I think, has changed things up a bit, work from home. It's really moved Japan 10 years forward, I hear many of my friends saying. And so we can sort of say, inverted commas, thanks to the pandemic, this has happened. It's happened in several ways, I think, by allowing, for example, flexibility for sharing of domestic work. And, in the workplace, I really feel there's been quite a big move. I talk with a lot of older men in my business, older Japanese men who are often on this other side of things when I'm doing business here with my clients. And men have told me how empowered they feel by acquiring Zoom and other IT skills. It's really unbelievable. Work from home forced them to act. They can now set up meeting invitations. They can do meetings themselves with this kind of renewed joy. It's quite surprising.
Men's empowerment.
It's men's empowerment that will help others. They don't need their female secretary now to do everything for them. So strangely to see, but it's really exciting for me too, because they've now got this autonomous way of doing things. And this may not sound like a lot to maybe New Zealand listeners, but for traditional Japanese men, I see this as a really positive step for them and their colleagues. And anecdotally, I know amongst my three of my friends, and one of them may be on the call today, but they have Japanese husbands, and for one of them, the husband resigned during COVID and is now helping her in her business completely. The other two couples, one of the male in the family, the Japanese male, does the majority of the cooking. And now one of those couples, they exercise together during this time. So they're really finding that such a reminder for slowing down, Misa, and prioritizing the basics, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then also I think within my legal community, I'm seeing a real definite shift to well-being and flexibility, and people are moving, the partners in the firms are moving from a focus on presenteeism and face time to output, which is a real big difference. So Misa, what about you from your perspective there? What are you seeing from home and work?
Yeah, I definitely see, from my friends' anecdotes, more men taking up the work at home, lots of changes in gender roles. And for me, of all the pandemic stories that I've heard from my friends, one of the best is the no more tea ladies. Okay, so I know many of you know, like in Japanese businesses, there is a term, ojakumi, which literally means tea squad in English, and female workers. In Japan, female workers are expected to, or forced to, I guess, serve tea or refreshments to their male coworkers or external guests. And thanks to COVID, for hygiene reasons, women are no longer needing to do any of that stuff at meetings, and that's that's like a real triumph for me, because I used to have to do that working for a Japanese company. So yeah, COVID is making some really good practical changes in the workplace to promote gender equality. And so we talk about positive and negative experiences with the pandemic, but I think it's really important for us to take into account like social and economic factors that are playing a key role. There has been increasing polarization, as the rich or the wealthy have definitely benefited more than others in terms of job retention. We talk about telework and access to technology and wealth accumulation. So bigger companies definitely are coping better, like with cash-heavy resources, but not so much SMEs. Running around, with 30, 60 days cash flow. Stock markets, have been doing exceptionally well during the pandemic, despite, all the hardships experienced by many citizens and businesses and women, So it's always good to take into account that socioeconomic aspect of the experience.
For sure. And I mean, there we go. 2 examples. The ochagumi has gone and the secretary is doing all the work has gone.
It's gone.
I mean, maybe this doesn't sound so big for some of our audience, but for Japan, this is huge to get rid of those old traditions. And Misa, I mean, you're there at Education New Zealand and Japan, and you are focusing on education and schools. How's it in that space? I'd really love to hear about that, because Jenny also pulled that out at the beginning when she introduced you. How's it been for those people, women who are in those educational and school spaces?
Yeah, lots of impacts, positive impacts in the education sector as well. Well, first of all, like Japan's lagging behind in online education. And just to give you an idea, according to the Japanese Ministry of Education survey, fewer than 5% of schools provided online learning last year during school closure. And it's kind of counterintuitive to your impression of Japan being technologically advanced, high-tech, but when it comes to the education sector, technology is still regarded as just playing video games and watching anime. So, but then COVID has definitely prompted the educators to look at technology as a valid educational tool. So we at Education New Zealand, we have been doing a lot of promotion of innovative edtech companies like Code Avengers, promoting digital learning platforms to Japanese educators. And besides digital education, what I want to talk about today is I see that there has been an increasing attention paid to EQ. And I think EQ is now like turning into a buzzword in Japan. EQ, known as emotional intelligence in Japan. Put it simply, more Japanese people, including myself, we're doing emotions together, and we're doing vulnerability like Brené Brown more than ever before. And COVID has thankfully normalized our conversations somewhat on, us talking about emotions and feelings. And EQ also, in the education context, EQ has a global relevance. And as many of you know, OECD, through its PISA ranking, it started measuring global competence for the first time in 2018. And global competence is not directly related to IQ. It is defined as, and let me read this here, it is defined as the capacity to examine local, global, and intercultural issues to understand and appreciate the perspectives of worldviews of others. So that's that global competence. I mean, competence is at the core of New Zealand education. It is embedded in the New Zealand government's international education strategy. And so last year, we at Education New Zealand, we have partnered with Massey University in New Zealand to deliver this online program called the New Zealand Global Competence Certificate, known as the NZGCC. And it's an amazing program. It's research-based, and it teaches global competence skills like empathy, self-awareness, and it's learned through both self-guided study and live discussion sessions. And I am very happy to share the news that the Tokyo Metropolitan Board of Education has agreed with us to deliver this program, connecting school students from Tokyo and Wanganui in New Zealand. So a lot of good stuff happening in the education sector. Yeah.
Wow, that is amazing news. How exciting.
Yeah, like it's really great to see this new development and new way of
Yeah.
New Zealand and Tokyo working together. And yeah, like we're just about to launch the 6 weeks program. So I'll keep you
Excellent.
posted on this. Yeah, excellent.
Excellent. As I said before, you know, there are chances, even though you think New Zealand's so small and we're, you know, not a big nation in the world, we have a big power here in this kind of way of delivering courses to Japan, not only Japan, directly into Tokyo, where both you and I are right now. That is terribly exciting. Well done,
Yeah.
Misa.
Yeah, thank you. And also we see in Japanese media, New Zealand Prime Minister's leadership, which embodies EQ, empathy and self-awareness and other soft skills. So I think this came out really timely, and it's a really timely launch of the program. So I'm just conscious of time. I've been just kind of talking, but just to round up our fireside chat, Catherine, looking at the post, I know Jenny said it's not post yet, you know, but looking at the post-pandemic world, and I wanted to ask you about your predictions in terms of gender roles. Are we going back to tea ladies, or are we moving forward from there? Or
no more tea ladies. I think I need to get some meme out there. No more tea ladies, no more secretaries doing the work, all the work anyway. So thanks, Misa. I think it's hard to make predictions. I don't have a crystal ball, but I do think there's going to be changes around this uneven share of household responsibilities, for one thing. It's actually quite interesting to go back to the 1979 when there was a government survey done, and 70% of women and 75% of men agreed that husbands should be the breadwinners and wives should take care of the home. And then that shifted in 2019 to 30% women, 40% men. And there's no real statistics yet about what the pandemic's going to do to those percentages, but surely those are going to change and there'll be less rigidity around that. Also, and I can't help but look at the Q&A and see that there has been a question on this, and I'm really delighted to talk about it too, because the encouragement of men's participation in family life, that's really been actively happening. The government had a campaign and still does have a campaign called Get Dads Cooking. And there's also another project that's been around since 2010 called Ikumen Project. And this is a fusion of two Japanese words, ikuji, which means childcare, and ikemen, which means handsome men. So obviously this it's very much like this Kiwi tradition, right, of Kiwi husband and looking after the family, after the kids. So what the essence is here is that a man in Japan who does childcare is really promoted as a shining star and an attractive standout guy. And so this program is actually a way, all jesting aside, a really good program and a way to get men very comfortable with saying, I can be an ikemen and I can look after my children. So I think that's one thing. One thing that really needs to change, I guess, would be parental leave. In Japan, can you believe that even only 7.5% of Japanese men take advantage of parental leave here, even though Japan has one of the longest parental leaves available to it in OECD. They get 1 year, but only 7.5% of men have taken it. So I hope that we will actually see a change in that area too, Misa, as we move forward. And I think the only other aspect I'd like to say is about surnames in Japan. Mostly surnames are, you have to change your surname when you become married in Japan. And actually a recent Supreme Court decision said the same thing, that we should retain this view of having people marry and changing their surname. So this was actually something that we thought was going to change in Japan, but hasn't, due to a very recent last month decision. So I think that's probably going to be something that's not going to change. And I did say final, but I've got one more final point, Jenny, is that in Japan, the goal for leadership positions, and I think this has come up in the Q&A, but I might speak a little bit to it because I was thinking about this before, is leadership. 30% of leadership positions by 2020 should have been held by women, but that's been moved out by the Kedanlen and by other other organizations. So I really think we need to see women at the top in Japan. If people see women here at the top, they can aspire to be leaders. And 77% of people interviewed, surveyed recently said they hoped for, or rather hoped for, a Japanese female prime minister. And I noticed in the Japan Times this morning, Misa, I'm not sure if you saw it, but Governor Koike, who was a female governor of Tokyo, your friend on the other side of the program that you're putting out there, she said she hasn't indicated she will stand again, but there seems to be another focus back on her to come back into the national side of things, and perhaps she could be something we could look forward to. And I think also young millennial men in Japan now are asking for work-life balance. So I really feel that area, young Japanese men, a real shining star for us in the future.
Yeah, I feel like there is a divide between, a shift, but between generation XYZ versus, above. There's, the younger, the millennials are definitely, they grew up with #MeToo. So, and also policies like, financial incentives like the gender GLI, will hopefully further push for the equal gender representation at workforce. So, but from my side, just quickly, I think, again, I have been talking a lot about health and mental health, and I don't really have predictions per se, but definitely COVID has prompted us to look at women's health, or femtech, or female technology. So femtech is, it's a word referring to products and services that are using technology to focus on women's health. So this could include like fertility solutions, or period tracking app, or women's sexual wellness, and the list goes on. And I feel like COVID again has sort of normalized our interest in women's health, and more people are talking about it. But unfortunately, in Japan, still to this day, just like mental health, women's health is not so much talked about, and it's still very much a taboo. But femtech, in Japanese is femteku, like is, as a starter, like it sounds so much more appealing and cooler than, I don't know, PMS or seiritsu in Japanese. And I see that a lot of male teachers were using femtech in their classrooms, which I thought was really awesome. So I think these are some of the changes happening around femtech, and I hope that more women get tested and get sort of get checked up and get to know how their mind and body work, and so we can have an open conversation about sharing our experiences. And that to me is really the definition of women's empowerment. And yes, I think lots of good stuff happening for the future.
Right. I think that femtech word is quite Japanese in that it's quite indirect.
Catchy.
In Japanese. Yeah, it's catchy, but it's also indirect. It's not actually saying what it is, and it gives people sort of power to say it. So I really thank you, Misa, for this conversation. We're moving on time, and it's been so much fun, and we could talk about a whole lot more. But I want to head over to Jennifer Curtin, because you have a lot of information over there about the New Zealand side of things and how women in New Zealand have been affected by the pandemic. So I'd really love to hear your insights, as we all would. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you, Catherine and Misa. I'm just gonna share my slides. I'm hoping that is what you can see. I need to change my display settings, right? And I need to get rid of looking at myself. Okay. So I want to just say kia ora, konnichiwa, and good afternoon to everyone who's on the webinar. And I want to thank the North Asia Centre of Asia Pacific Excellence for inviting me to talk with you this afternoon. So I'm just going to walk through some of the challenges and impacts on women in New Zealand and the policy challenges that have emerged as a result. And so while I'm conscious that Catherine and Misa have offered quite a sort of both a barriers and an opportunities dimension, I think my talk is probably just a little bit more on the negative side. So I would say, just to link the two talks together, it's really interesting that Misa brought up EQ. And so in New Zealand, as most of you will know, we went hard, we went early, we locked down our borders, we locked down our domestic, population. And this was led by a Prime Minister with outstanding communication skills, a capacity to deliver hard messages in a way that's empathetic and authentic. She used a variety of media channels and in a sense was able to bring New Zealanders, most New Zealanders, with her in what was seen globally as, a stellar performance by her, but also increasingly sort of anti-libertarian measures that you wouldn't normally expect from a liberal democracy. So what I want to do in my brief time is to just focus primarily on women's participation in the labour market and some broader policy responses that have happened within New Zealand, but also how it connects with the global, because I think even though New Zealand might be seen as a unique case in some senses, we also, the women of New Zealand are experiencing very similar things to what we've heard about in Japan, but also what we've seen elsewhere. So what we know about the impacts on women in the New Zealand labour market are very similar to many economies. Service industries have been hit hardest by our border closures and lockdown. So here we're talking hospitality, retail and tourism. And in New Zealand, women comprise over 60% of sales workers and over 70% of hospitality workers. And in addition to that, they're close to 85% of health sector workers, and that has brought additional risks. So they're essential workers, and with that comes an increased risk of exposure to the virus. So during the height of the pandemic, if you like, the 2020 June quarter labour market statistics in New Zealand showed that there were 11,000 fewer people in paid employment, and 10,000 of those were women. So it was women in the majority who were, who were losing their jobs, even though we did have wage subsidies. And what we also know is that the female underutilisation rate increased during that quarter from 12.5% to close to 15%. So this represents more than 29,000 women, an increase of 29,000 women looking for more hours of work. We also know that sometimes when you look at things like job seeker as a measure, so an unemployment benefit rates as a measure of, oh, women haven't been hit that hard, which was what some commentators and politicians were saying, that's sometimes because women, when they're under pressure to balance paid work and unpaid care and look after the kids and so on, choose to withdraw from seeking paid work for a period of time, which we know has longer term implications for their superannuation and various other measures of wealth down the track. So overall, women's unemployment rate rose to 4.5%, but we also saw increased unpaid labour, and we know that some stopped seeking paid work as a result of the pandemic. But what I want to share with you is that how this reflects the global picture. So the International Labour Organization put out a report this month that confirms globally that women's employment remains negatively impacted in 2021. And this is about the quantity of work available, so the number of jobs, but also the quality of work. Like, is it decent work that women are being able to take up and do? And so while there are regional variations and trends, and there are also have been quite varied government measures put in place to offset those trends, really what we know from a global perspective is that pre-existing structural inequalities for women have been exacerbated by this pandemic. Gender pay gaps are increasing. There are still long shifts that women have to work. There are limited opportunities for career progression. Partly this is related to heavily feminised sectors being less valued. So none of these things are actually new because they existed pre-pandemic. But what the ILO is saying now with their global data that they've collected is that there is a risk that what the pandemic has done is entrenched some of those inequalities, and there is this risk that women will be more permanently left behind in terms of economic and social well-being. And of course, what we also know is that there are intersectional dimensions to this kind of disadvantage. So migrant workers, ethnic and racial minorities, older people, and those with disabilities have seen the quality of their jobs dampened. And so I think this graph shows you quite clearly how there's this massive dip, and while there is an increase, really there's still a long, that rate of change, there are still risks for women in the labour market. And I think even though that this is the global picture, when you can go to the report and see what it looks like for the Asia Pacific, and the trend line is quite similar to this trend line here. Now there's a lot on this slide, but basically it's some stats that I've pulled together that try and capture the additional dimensions that Misa and Catherine talked about earlier, that we see women doing increased care work, experiencing isolation, risks of higher levels of family and domestic violence, digital exclusion, and the intersectional effects that overlay gender inequalities. So we know that more than half of women look after children. 61% in 2018 census data were looking after the ill and disabled. So that's likely to have continued and been increased during the pandemic. Women in New Zealand, there is such appallingly high rates of intimate partner violence in New Zealand, and women comprise 77% of those victims, and there's still data being collected in New Zealand on what the pandemic has meant for women who are at risk from intimate partner violence. I think it's easy to forget about those who live alone. So we know that of those over 75 living alone in New Zealand, 73% are women. So living alone brings with it significant challenges, as does being a sole parent. So 27% of sole parents in New Zealand recently gave a low life satisfaction rating, compared to 12% of partnered parents to dependent children. So we have to, and we know that 83% of those sole parents are women. So there are some real risks around the isolation front, and that goes to Catherine's point about, and Misa's, about the need to look after mental health of people during pandemic, but of women in particular. Then there's the whole issue of needing to go online. And so I went down this rabbit hole trying to collect data on internet access, who's digitally literate, who has sufficient digital skills to be online, how to stay safe online and secure online. And what we can see is that, we are not yet sufficiently digitally inclusive to be able to cope with pandemics in this way, and that actually poverty, income inequality is one of the key drivers of those who get left behind as a result of digital exclusion. And we also know that some of these impacts are felt most by Māori and Pacifica, but also disabled people and people with English as a second language. One final point on this very negative perspective on what's happening to women as a result of the pandemic is Māori and Pacifica women were really hit hard by the 2008 global financial crisis. And what we know is that 10 years later, the unemployment rate amongst Māori and Pacifica women is still 2 to 3 times higher than for European women. And what we also know from our EEO commissioner is that the gender pay gap for Pacifica women who work in the public service is 22%. So even though our generic figure is that New Zealand has a gender pay gap of around 8 or 9%, and we might think that's not too bad. Actually, when we disaggregate data and look at it intersectionally, we see that the story is not, is a lot more grim. Now, I would just say that the government hasn't been remiss in focusing on this, the issues facing women, but so their initial March 22 economic recovery package provided some funding for women, and the Ministry for Women did an analysis of this after the fact, and did a ranking on what the policies were and how they impacted on women neutrally, positively or negatively, and it was a mixed bag. And since then, when we've seen a lot of budgets talking about economic recovery and trying to build back better, which is a very popular term, we've done some analysis on the budgets that have taken place, and we in 2020 and 2021, and we can see that really it's been very traditional in the focus. So the focus has been on physical infrastructure rather than social infrastructure, and investing in those areas which are traditionally male jobs. And so while there have been schemes to try and encourage more women to retrain and move into those roles, that are connected with physical infrastructure, that's going to take some time. And actually women might want to work in the care industries, but be valued for working in those sectors, and we're not there yet. So finally then, I would argue we need more of a coherent gender responsive recovery approach. And I would really urge people to just have a look at the policy brief that came out this month by the ILO. Their mantra is building forward fairer rather than building back better. And it captures this idea that we need, and they have a whole section on what countries have done and what economies have done to be more gender responsive in their recovery. And why is this necessary? Well, the fiscal stimulus packages this time round have been greater than the GFC fiscal responses, but there's been limited investment in gender responsive programs. So of the 580 fiscal and economic measures put in place in 132 countries that have supported business, only 12% were directed at female-dominated sectors. We know there's good international practice out there that we could be emulating and adapting for our countries. Intersectional gender mainstreaming, gender responsive budgeting, investing in social infrastructure, resisting early debt repayment and starting off down an austerity track, and growing income support and decent work. So in New Zealand, we've seen some useful tools. There's a growing commitment to centre Te Tiriti o Waitangi in policy analysis to ensure our Indigenous people are centred and able to co-govern and put their participate in policy that impacts on their lives. We have a online gender analysis tool that's been developed by the Ministry for Women, and it's very accessible if you want to take a look. We have a government that's set in place a wellbeing framework for the public finance system. Doesn't have a gender lens built into it, but we still hope that we'll get there. And they've put in place new procurement rules for companies, and are starting on a women's employment action plan. So perhaps there's some hope there in that final little slide that I have. But in the end, I would argue that mainstreaming intersectional gender analysis is key to building forward fairer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for your contribution, and of course for the other two very strong points that have come up from in relation to Japan. Now we have a number of questions here, and some of them have been touched on, but I thought I might just pick up on the second last question around hopes. We've heard a lot about the inequalities and structural issues of inequalities, and some of the proposed innovations, some of the policy developments in New Zealand, and some of that is happening in Japan. But I thought I might just turn this question into thinking about the new generation, both in Japan and New Zealand. So hopes going forward, because I think this is always important. How do we shift gear? How do we really deal with these really challenging structural and cultural views that really impact on the progression of women and of course lead to very strong gender gaps in many aspects of society? So this question is around the impression of the author here is that young generation in Japan are politically indifferent. I'd be interested in the comments from Catherine and Misa, and then Jennifer reflecting on what she thinks about the younger generation in New Zealand.
Well, that's a real accurate comment, that generation that are young here are politically indifferent. The turnout at polls is remarkably low. And even recently there was a local election and the turnout was still very low. However, I see the difference not so much being in the political arena, Jenny, but more that it starts from the business sector. And if I go back to that comment I said about the new generation coming through the organization, I heard that anecdote directly from Kathy Matsui, who is the founder, the generator of Womenomics as a concept. She used to work at Goldman Sachs. She always received questions from women in her organization. How can I get work-life balance? How can I change the way I do my work and my life? And she said that increasingly the 70% of the inquiries were coming from men in Goldman Sachs, young men. So I take that as a really impressive and positive thing. She said she checked within Goldman Sachs globally about this. Were there men also saying this within those branches? And the answers were yes. So I think through the young business people, they will be models within the companies. Their kids will see this, their children will see this behavior, and this will bring up a different generation that will then influence, I think, the political sphere. So that's my opinion. I think it's going to start from within business. And the Keidan Len, who we know is mentioned in an earlier question there, the Japanese business organization, they are also very careful and conscious about this. And so have a lot of power with the government and impressing the government. So I think there's going to be a better interaction between business and politics, changing the world from a business sense.
Thank you. Misa, did you want to add anything here?
As Catherine said, amongst Japanese young people, voting rate is exceptionally low. I think it's like something like 30%. So we need to vote. That's the first task. But we also need to see female role models, because if you look at the candidates, political candidates, do we see many women? No. Do we see a female newscaster talking about politics? No. So I think it's really important to create influencers and role models, female role models, to promote interest in politics. And in the education sector, Ministry of Education has a young ambassadors program called Tobitate Scholarship, as a public-private scholarship scheme, sending Japanese students overseas to study and to undertake internship programs. So we do have some ambassador programs like this, but we need to have role models. And I think that would definitely help change the gender equality.
Thank you. So Jennifer, have you got anything you'd like to add to this question?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I mean, the audience will probably know this from the New Zealand end, but we actually had an election during, in October last year. So it wasn't during the lockdown period, but we had a lockdown in Auckland in August that led to the delay of the election by a month, so everybody could campaign fairly. What we saw in New Zealand is, so we have, compared to Japan, relatively high levels of turnout, so around the low 70s. This is considered low for New Zealand because we like, having 90%, which is what we had back in the 50s. But what we saw that was different about this election was the 18 to 24-year-old turnout went up significantly. and young people turned out almost as much and as almost as great as numbers as those over 70, and those are considered our most politically active, those who've been in the electorate longer, I suppose. So that was really interesting, and we've had a lot of climate strikes and a lot of young people so I wouldn't characterise young people generally in New Zealand as apathetic. I would say that there are definitely a lot of activists out there campaigning on climate change, on anti-poverty, on homelessness, on food insecurity, quite significantly. That said, at the political level more generally, we do have those role models. So we don't just have Jacinda Ardern, we have the most diverse cabinet and representative cabinet. We have a Māori woman as our foreign minister. We have Pacifica women and migrant women, and lots of diversity in the parliament more generally. So I think the role models are there. My challenge and my call out, I suppose, to business and organisations more generally is that and it goes back to your points, Misa and Catherine, about culture and workplace culture. So we know from the report called the Francis Report that our parliament is a really toxic place to work, and it's not appealing to many people, let alone perhaps the younger generation of women who might be thinking that they could emulate Jacinda Ardern or Nanaia Mahuta's career path, right? And we've seen that, as you said, in law firms. So the Me Too thing isn't just a protest movement, it's a call to organisations to change their culture, to welcome, especially in jobs where women are likely to be the minority. So they need to feel accepted and welcomed, and not asked to bend to some kind of male norms that they might, that might mean that they continue to feel as though they're outsiders and tokenistic in that workplace.
Thank you. Now, several of the questions that we have here do touch on very similar issues, and I'm thinking that there's one here that is quite, I think, interesting around referring to the overworking culture in Japan and whether that you see that as changing. And of course, the second part of that question, I think we have touched on this during the conversation around whether, the flexible work arrangements is going to actually push women out of permanent positions. So I'd just be interested in any comments from Catherine or Misa on that.
So, flexible working, I think it's here to stay. I don't think everyone's going to embrace it, but I think there's enough of a core in the population now who've been working away from the office and seen the generosity and the beauty of flexibility in working, that there will be an embracing of that going further forward. There's also a core who I know, and I've spoken with them, who can't wait to get back to how it was. But with everything globally being very, very different, it will never be. I don't think it will ever be the same again. So I think there will be a refreshed view around flexibility. People have realized in Japan that you can actually get a whole lot of work done. It's very efficient. And so I think that's here to stay. I don't know what the exact prediction will be on that. My work business model is based on flexibility, so I certainly hope that this does continue to be a trend. And then I've completely forgotten what the second part of the question was. Could you remind me again, Jenny, what the second bit was?
Yes, it's about whether flexible work arrangements are going to actually be beneficial for women or in fact push them out of permanent positions in the workforce.
Right. So I think the permanent positions, they don't always have to be in the office. They can be outside of the office. And I think this is what COVID-19 has shown us, that people can perform their work at home, especially when they've got a male or a partner supporting them at home for the other bits of the work life that we talked about before. So I think in changing the way that men do their work, it's going to enable women to be able to be flexible and work in permanent positions, but not necessarily in an office space, but from external, from from the home. So that would be my view.
Now, look, we've got time for one more question, which I'd like each of you to address. It's a final question that's popped up on our question list about how can we encourage women to come back more strongly after the pandemic. And I think we've all been talking about that in terms of the impacts. And we've thought about, we know that government policies are trying to address some of these things, but it's also cultural. So just interested in a final wrap-up comment from each of you.
I'll just go quickly, and also adding to Catherine's comments earlier. I actually see some of my friends moving out of Tokyo to rural areas of Japan to take advantage of telework, and I think that's a positive change, and that could help alleviate the overworking culture or promote entrepreneurship, and also support the rural economies suffering from depopulation in the last couple of decades. So I just wanted to add that to the question. Thanks.
I think there's so much power in just one single person. You heard the petition that I mentioned before. That was one young activist female who went and did something. We are 120 million people in Japan, and half of that are female. Imagine the power of all of those ones together who can do something. So I think we need to be thinking about not the difficulty or how hard it is, but actually encouraging women to come forward and do things, get together as your ones become a team and do something as a team together and move things further forward. You can see in my up above me, I'm a podcaster as well, and one of my guests, Naomi Koshi, is an individual who also changed the childcare system in Japan and created childcare facilities so that women could then go back to work. So she's one person. The lady I mentioned before with the petition is one person. Imagine what we could all do. So I would encourage people to go back, become stronger as one, as groups of ones together, and take things further forward.
Oh, so I suppose I would wrap up by saying I get concerned. I suppose I would have concerns of asking individual women to be the ones to make the change. I suppose as a political scientist and a public policy person, I would be saying women are 50% or 51% of the voters. It's time to flex our muscle and demand that governments actually start thinking about us at the beginning of their problem solving, rather than patching things up at the end because suddenly they realise they haven't done their gender impact assessments. So their planning, their design, their work needs to be better. If they don't realise it, then we need to make a noise so that they do.
Well, thank you very much to the panel. We've had a very rich and I think productive exchange of views and information. And what is clear to me is that we have a lot to learn from each other, even if we may be at some different points in a spectrum. There's no question that indeed that in a sense we're all in this together. We've got a lot to learn, and we've also got quite a long way to go. But I guess we can conclude on a sense of optimism. There's always, I think, some moving forward as we get pummeled by things like a pandemic, which we didn't anticipate. So thank you very much for contributing to the North Asia Cape series today. But just before I wind up, I would just like to note that there is a National Council of Women event. They're holding their annual women's debate for 2021, which will be an online panel of members of Parliament discussing women and COVID on the 28th of July. So those of you follow-up details, the registration detail will be on the CAPE website. And do follow anything on the CAPE website that you're interested in and sign up to the newsletter. So just again, a very big thank you to the panel. It's been a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you, Jenny.
Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you.
ありがとうございます。
ありがとうございました。